Russia begins not with a city, but with a wilderness, a land so vast it folds time into space, forests that stretch for days, rivers that turn to ice, mountains that whisper borders no one dares cross. From the edge of Europe to the cliffs of the Pacific, it is less a country than a continent stitched together by struggle, ambition, and cold. Before tsars or Soviets, before czars or commissars, this was a land of tribes and tundra, where survival was the only politics, and geography ruled absolutely. How do you govern 11 time zones? How do you settle a territory built on permafrost, floodplain and steppe? How do you build an empire when roads vanish in snow? Yet somehow out of this chaotic immensity, a pattern emerged: state over subject, land over law, endurance over reform. From Kiev to Novgorod, Moscow to St. Petersburg, power migrated but never dissolved. Russia would become not just a state, but a psyche, armoured, wounded, defiant. This is the story of how forests became fortresses, how steppe became stage, how exile and empire built the same bones. Because in Russia, nothing is ever just new. It is rebuilt from the ashes of something that refused to die. Ice, rivers, and the first footprints. Long before it was Russia, this was land caught between freeze and flood. A vast, chaotic plain shaped by glaciers, hemmed by mountains to the south, and scoured by wind across endless steppe. The climate was merciless. Winters could crack bone. Summers drowned fields in thaw. But between these extremes, life clung on, and eventually, life organised. The geography that would define Russia's destiny also defined its fragility. There were no Alps for defence, no Mediterranean for trade. Instead, rivers, wide, slow, navigable rivers, the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga, and the Neva. These were not just water routes, they were the original roads, carving through forest and grassland, linking distant tribes, enabling movement where land was otherwise impassable. By 6000 BCE, Neolithic communities dotted these riverbanks, fishing, farming, and forming seasonal camps. The land offered fur, flint, and fish, but civilization was slow to root. The great early urban centres, Uruk, Thebes, Mohenjo-daro, rose far away. Here the cold and scale delayed density. Tribes remained loose, migratory, fiercely independent, but they watched the rivers, and the rivers watched back. By the first millennium BCE, Slavic tribes had emerged across the western plains, decentralised, often at odds but sharing language and custom. They were joined by Finno-Ugric peoples in the north, Turkic nomads to the east, and soon waves of Scandinavian Norse traders and raiders from the Baltic Sea. These Norse, called Varangians, didn't just raid, they stayed. By the 9th century CE, they navigated south along the Dnieper, founding trade outposts, fortresses, and eventually city-states. From the collision of Slavic soil and Norse steel, the earliest Russian state began to coalesce. Kievan Rusi. Its geography would shape its soul. No mountains to stop invasion, no oceans to protect its borders. Just vastness, inhospitable, undefended, beautiful. To survive here, you didn't compromise. You endured. This crucible forged a civilization not centered on cities, but on distance, conquest over cohesion, dominance over diversity. Even in these earliest layers, a Russian pattern emerges: strength before stability, land before liberty, endurance before elegance. Kievan Rus would rise quickly, but it was not the first empire to pass over this soil, and it would not be the last. Because Russia, from the start, was a place people moved through, and only rarely did someone stay long enough to rule. In the 9th century, the rivers of the steppe became highways of power. Along their banks, a patchwork of cities and tribes slowly stitched into a loose federation under Norse Slavic rulers, the Varangian princes. At its heart, Kiev, a hilltop stronghold overlooking the Dnieper River, controlling the trade route from the Baltic to Byzantium. This was Kievan Rus, a realm built not on conquest, but on connection. Furs and slaves flowed south, coins and silk flowed north. It was a merchant kingdom, fluid, decentralized, and deeply influenced by its richer, older southern neighbour, the Byzantine Empire. In 988 CE, everything changed. Prince Vladimir the Great converted to Orthodox Christianity, not just as faith, but as strategy. He baptized his realm in the Dnieper River, married a Byzantine princess, and invited Greek priests, architects and scribes into his court. Churches rose in stone. Cyrillic script took root. Pagan gods were replaced by icons, relics and incense. A spiritual gravity now anchored the Russian lands, not toward Rome or the steppe, but toward Constantinople. Religion became identity, and identity became instrument. But Kievan Rus was not a state in the modern sense. It was a collection of princely domains, Novgorod, Smolensk, Suzdal, Kiev, held together by trade routes, bloodlines and shifting alliances. Succession was unclear, fratricide was common. As the centuries passed, internal conflict and external pressure mounted. The Dnieper routes declined. Byzantium weakened, trade shifted east, and then the steppe rode in. In the 13th century, Mongol horsemen swept across the Eurasian plains like wildfire. Cities burned, princes bowed. Kiev was sacked in 1240, reduced to ash and silence. The Mongols, known locally as the Tatar yoke, did not colonize, they taxed, they ruled through intermediaries. And one city, once peripheral, began to rise by collecting tribute on their behalf. Moscow. Nestled in the forests of the northeast, Moscow had no ancient pedigree, but it had advantages: defensible terrain, access to river networks and shrewd, ambitious princes. By paying tribute reliably and slowly absorbing rival territories, the Muscovites became the favoured agents of Mongol power, and over time they prepared to replace it. In 1380, Prince Dmitry Donskoy led a coalition of Russian forces against the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was symbolic. It proved the Mongols could be challenged. The myth of their invincibility cracked. Then in 1480, under Ivan III, the Great, Moscow refused to pay tribute. The Mongols came. They stared across the Ugra River. Then they turned back. The yoke was broken. Ivan declared Moscow the third Rome. The first, Rome, had fallen. The second, Constantinople, had been conquered by the Ottomans. Now Moscow, orthodox and autocratic, would inherit the mantle of Christian empire. He married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, adopted the double-headed eagle as his symbol, and began calling himself Tsar, from Caesar. From the ashes of Kiev and the shadow of the steppes, a new empire was stirring, less mercantile, more militant, less open, more insular. Born not from a crossroads, but from a fortress in a forest. A state forged by survival, guided by scripture, obsessed with order, and ready soon to expand. By the 16th century, the forest principality of Moscow had transformed into something new, an empire by ambition, not accident, and at its centre stood a figure both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible. In 1547 he became the first crowned Tsar of all Rus, claiming not just power, but divine mandate. He ruled with scripture in one hand and steel in the other. Under Ivan, Moscow ceased to be a city-state and became a machine for expansion. The once fractured Rus' territories were absorbed into a single, centralised autocracy. Serfdom was codified, nobility was crushed, dissent was drowned in blood, but Ivan wasn't just consolidating, he was reaching outward. In 1552, the Tsar's armies stormed Kazan, capital of the Tatar Khanate. Then Astrakhan, the Volga was claimed. The Mongol threat, once insurmountable, was reversed. The empire now extended deep into the steppe, and soon beyond. To the east lay Siberia, a vast frozen frontier rich in furs and myth. Cossack explorers, traders and exiles pushed across the Urals, sailing down rivers no map had named, planting orthodox crosses and Tsarist banners on lands older than memory. By the early 1600s, Russia had reached the Pacific Ocean. In 2 centuries, the empire had expanded more than any in history, not by sea but by snow and silence. But while the borders ballooned, the core trembled. Ivan died mad, his son feeble. A dynastic vacuum followed, the time of troubles, an era of famine, pretenders, foreign invasion, and civil war. Poles occupied the Kremlin, Moscow starved, Russia nearly dissolved. Then in 1613, a compromise prince was elected tsar, Michael Romanov, a teenager with ties to both church and boyars. His dynasty would rule for the next 300 years. The Romanovs rebuilt what Ivan had scorched: bureaucracy, church, army. Order returned at a cost. And then came Peter. In 1682, Peter the Great took the throne and tore Russia into modernity by force. He studied shipbuilding in Dutch shipyards. He shaved beards. He crushed rebellions. He built a new capital, St. Petersburg, on a swamp, facing west, carved by labourers who died by the thousands. A window to Europe, he called it. Peter didn't reform Russia. He overwrote it. He secularised schools, created ministries, reorganised the army and navy, imposed European dress. He went to war with Sweden, the Ottomans, Persia, anyone who blocked his vision of Russia as a European empire. And he won. By the time of his death in 1725, Russia had become a recognised great power. No longer a semi-feudal giant hiding in forests. It was now a player in continental politics. One foot in Europe, the other in Asia. A cultural schizophrenic, but a military reality. His successors, especially Catherine the Great, continued the project. Under Catherine, Russia absorbed Crimea, expanded into Poland, and became patron of Orthodox Christians across the Ottoman border. The court glittered with Enlightenment ideals, French salons, and neoclassical art. But the Enlightenment stayed at the top. For the peasants, serfs in all but name, the empire remained brutal. Land was still owned by the few. Rebellions smouldered constantly. None succeeded. Still, Russia endured. Not because it was just, but because it was strong, expansive, and unyielding. Russia had wealth, territory, prestige. It controlled half of Europe's grain trade. Its armies marched into Paris in 1814 after defeating Napoleon. The Tsar was not just monarch, he was emperor of all the Russias, protector of orthodoxy, heir to Byzantium, jailer of nations. But every can overreach. Beneath the splendour, the cracks were forming. Industrialisation lagged. Reform was avoided. Serfs remained shackled. The state could expand, but not adapt. And in the frozen soil of this golden age, revolutionary seeds had already been planted. The 19th century ended with Russia triumphant in territory, but teetering in every other sense. Beneath the gleam of palaces and imperial pageantry, the structure groaned. A modern empire built on medieval foundations, serfdom, censorship, absolute monarchy, was unsustainable. And Russia's rulers knew it. They just didn't know how to let go. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs, but freedom came without land, security, or rights. The countryside burned with resentment. In the cities, a new force stirred: students, writers, anarchists, idealists who read banned books and dreamed of revolution. Alexander was called the Tsar Liberator. Then in 1881, he was assassinated by a bomb. His successors retreated into repression. Reform halted, secret police expanded, and the clock kept ticking. In 1905, after a disastrous war with Japan, workers marched on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They came with petitions. The Tsar's soldiers responded with bullets. Bloody Sunday ignited strikes, uprisings, and mutinies across the empire. Tsar Nicholas II offered a parliament, the Duma, but clipped its power. Trust never recovered. Then came World War I, a conflict Russia entered to project strength and ended in collapse. Millions died, cities starved, soldiers deserted. Revolution rippled from factories to front lines. In February 1917, the Romanov dynasty fell. After over 300 years, the Tsar abdicated. Crowds cheered in the streets. A provisional government took power, promising elections, peace and reform. But Russia had already passed the point of slow fixes. In October 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks stormed Petrograd and seized power in the name of the workers. Their slogans were simple: peace, land, bread. What followed was far from simple. The Russian Civil War pitted red against white, revolutionaries against monarchists, peasants against landlords, brother against brother. Entire cities were razed, villages turned to famine zones, foreign armies invaded. But by 1922, the Bolsheviks had won, and in the ashes, they proclaimed a new experiment: the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This was not just a new government, it was a new world. Religion outlawed, private property abolished, the calendar changed, the very fabric of identity, worker, peasant, comrade, was rewritten. Lenin died in 1924, embalmed like a pharaoh. Then Stalin rose, first as a bureaucrat, then as a dictator. Under him, the revolution became a machine. Cities industrialized at breakneck speed. Farms were collectivized. Millions were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. The Holodomor in Ukraine, the man-made famine of the 1930s, killed millions. Fear became policy. History was edited. Truth became fluid. And yet the USSR modernized. It built dams, factories, railroads. It electrified the countryside. It became a superpower of cement and ideology. Even the worst horrors were framed as necessary steps on the path to utopia. Then came Hitler. In 1941, Germany invaded. Stalin was caught off guard. The Nazis pushed to the gates of Leningrad, Stalingrad, Moscow. But the Soviet Union did not break. It bled. It fought street by street, trench by trench. Stalingrad became a graveyard of German ambition. By 1945, the Red Army was in Berlin. 20 million Soviets had died, but fascism was defeated. The USSR emerged a victor and a shell. It rebuilt with steel and scars. It controlled Eastern Europe. It detonated an atomic bomb. It launched Sputnik. It sent Gagarin to space. The Cold War began. Two systems, two empires, staring each other down across ideology and oceans. But inside the USSR, strain returned. The economy stagnated. Dissent flickered. In 1979, the Soviet-Afghan War became a quagmire. By the 1980s, even the Kremlin admitted the system was decaying. Gorbachev tried to fix it. Glasnost, perestroika, openness and reform. But the centre couldn't hold. Republics broke away. Protests surged. The facade cracked.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands.
In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. A red flag was lowered from the Kremlin. An empire built on revolution had dissolved without a single cannon fired in its defence. And once again, from the wreckage, a new Russia would emerge. Unfinished, unbalanced and unsure of its place in the world it had helped create. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was more than political. It was psychological. For the first time in centuries, Russia was not an empire. No tsar, no commissar, no ideological mission to rally around. Just chaos, confusion, and a map that had shrunk overnight. 15 new countries emerged from the rubble. Russia was the largest, but no longer dominant. The ruble collapsed. State industries, oil, gas, steel, were sold off in privatization so rapid they became looting in all but name. A handful of men, the oligarchs, became billionaires overnight, while millions lost savings, pensions, purpose. Grocery shelves emptied, organised crime surged, life expectancy dropped. The 1990s were a decade of humiliation. Chechen wars, corruption, a drunken president, Boris Yeltsin, wavering between reform and repression. Parliament was shelled. The old certainties of empire and ideology were replaced by market shock and Western consultants. And then came Vladimir Putin. In 1999, a former KGB officer from Leningrad became prime minister. By 2000, he was president. He promised order, dignity, and revenge against chaos. He delivered it, with a price. Putin crushed the Second Chechen Rebellion with brute force. Cities like Grozny were flattened. Rebels were labelled terrorists. The war was televised, then erased. At home, he rebuilt the power vertical. He governors appointed, media tamed, oligarchs brought to heel or exiled. A new Russian elite emerged. Not aristocrats or commissars, but state-aligned billionaires in designer suits and Black Sea compounds. Flush with oil and gas wealth, Russia reasserted itself. Moscow became a capital of conspicuous wealth. Bentley dealerships, golden church domes restored, Soviet monuments repurposed, Orthodox ritual revived. The state and the church, long estranged, formed a new alliance: patriotism, tradition, and geopolitical grievance. Gone was the language of global revolution. In its place, sovereign democracy, Russian values, multipolar world order. The West, once idolized in the 90s, became the foil. In 2008, Russian tanks rolled into Georgia. In 2014, Crimea was annexed. Eastern Ukraine burned in proxy war. Hybrid warfare replaced Cold War binaries, cyber attacks, disinformation, deniability. Russia wasn't just back, it was remaking the rules. But inside, the contradictions deepened. The economy remained resource dependent. Corruption flowed top down. Political opposition was crushed or exiled. Journalists murdered. Protesters beaten. State TV dominated the narrative. Elections occurred, but outcomes rarely surprised. And yet this new Russia wasn't the USSR reborn. It was post-Soviet, post-imperial, and post-ideological, a hybrid of authoritarianism, consumerism, and nostalgia. A state that held elections and icons, stock exchanges and siloviki, security elites, smartphones and secret police. Culture adapted. Russian cinema, literature, and art pulsed with unease, irony, and memory. Cities modernized, metro stations gleamed, tech parks multiplied. At the same time, statues of Stalin quietly reappeared in provincial towns. Textbooks were rewritten. The Soviet past was no longer condemned, it was repackaged. This reinvention was not linear, it was conflicted. A tug of war between European aspirations and Eurasian legacy, between modernity and myth. Russia once again had survived collapse, but beneath the surface of restoration, another question loomed. Had it actually changed, or had it simply reloaded? Modern Russia is not a postscript. It is a contradiction that keeps moving. Vast, armed, culturally rich, politically hardened. It's a nation caught between 3 centuries: the autocracy of the czars, the trauma of the Soviets, and the optics of 21st century statecraft. On the surface, Russia looks like a contemporary power. Moscow gleams with neon skylines, luxury boutiques, and a digital public life centered around VK and Telegram. High-speed trains shoot across European Russia. Ballet companies tour the world. Universities teach quantum computing and Tolstoy in the same breath. But beneath the polished veneer is an older logic, a deep state architecture rooted in paranoia, centralization, and control. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has become not just governed, but curated. State television blends news and myth. Military parades evoke both World War II victory and Cold War threat. The 20th century's tragedies, the Gulag, the Holodomor, Stalinist purges, are carefully compartmentalized, regretted perhaps, but never disqualifying. The cult of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, has become civic religion. Veterans are honoured. Banners wave. History is not for questioning, but for unifying. Memory is selective, sacred, weaponized. And in 2022, memory was used as justification. Russia invaded Ukraine as a declared denazification, a historical echo twisted into rationale. Cities were bombed, civilians fled. Western sanctions bit deep, the global order jolted. Once again, Russian tanks moved west. Once again, the Kremlin insisted it was not conquest, it was correction. Inside Russia, dissent collapsed. Independent media shuttered, protesters imprisoned. Words like war became illegal in public discourse. Abroad, Russia was isolated, economically, diplomatically, culturally. Yet support at home, buoyed by state messaging and generational trauma, held strong in many quarters. Meanwhile, the Russian people remained complex and contradictory. Some waved flags, some mourned, some stayed silent, others fled. Artists left, coders relocated, mothers protested, veterans rallied. No monolith, just 146 million lives shaped by geography, guilt, pride and exhaustion. This is the Russian mosaic, one part imperial ambition, one part post-Soviet fatigue, one part long-suffering resilience. A nation that resists collapse not by reforming, but by retrenching. Culturally, Russia remains a powerhouse. Its literature, film and philosophy still interrogate meaning in ways few nations do. Its scientists push space, biotech and AI forward. Its people endure, because endurance here is not just a virtue, it is a national muscle memory. But the cracks are deepening. The economy strains under sanctions. Demographic decline accelerates. Regional unrest simmers beneath federal silence. The war in Ukraine drags on. Young Russians, more globally connected than ever, face a future shaped by decisions they didn't make, and borders they may not cross again. In Russia, the past never stays buried. It's built into the bricks, the bureaucracy, the bedtime stories. And now, in this newest iteration of Empire Without Name, the question returns. Is Russia still becoming something? Or is it circling back to what it has always been? Because in Russia, the modern is never just modern. It is layered, haunted, shaped by scars and statues. A state as much about memory as it is about might. Russia's future will not unfold along a straight road. It never has. It moves in cycles: centralization, expansion, collapse, retrenchment. A rhythm as old as the steppe wind and as deep as the Siberian permafrost. The next cycle is already forming. Demographically, the numbers are stark. Birth rates are plunging. Life expectancy, which had begun to recover post-1990s, is once again falling, driven by war, pandemic and strain. A nation built on vast manpower now faces labour shortages and shrinking youth cohorts. Whole towns in the Russian interior are emptying, their schools shuttered, their roads overgrown. Economically, sanctions have decoupled Russia from the West. SWIFT bans, oil price caps, export controls. Bit by bit, the global market is sealing off its avenues. China looms as a partner, but not a saviour. Tech isolation widens, brain drain continues. A closed Russia is a weaker Russia, no matter how many pipelines it redirects. Militarily, the war in Ukraine has rewritten the map of risk. What was once the spear of Russian influence, its army, is now an exposed wound. Morale bleeds. Equipment is lost. Veterans return not to parades, but to silence or propaganda. The human cost grows, so does the unease. And yet, the future is not collapse. It is redefinition. Inside Russia, new generations are quietly reshaping identity. In dissident circles, online subcultures, and underground art scenes, a different Russia breathes. One that questions empire, that values connection over conquest, that sees its history not as a script, but as something to rewrite. Carefully, painfully, slowly. The state will resist. It always has. But resistance doesn't erase change, it delays it. Eventually the past will loosen its grip. Because even here, even in a land where exile was once more common than voting, where the state has outlived its citizens more than once, transformation is not impossible. It is inevitable. The only question is, what comes next? Another strongman? A federal unravelling? A cultural thaw? No one can say, because Russia does not move until it moves. And when it does, it moves all at once.